So, chapter 3, section 6 onwards then. This recording will take us through to the end of chapter 3. And what we're going to be looking at is business structure. So we're going to look at the different types of business structure that we can have. They're outlined underneath here. So we can look at sole traderships, partnerships, companies. We're also going to have a look at a few different types of alliance. So let's get started. What do we mean by a sole tradership? So sole tradership, start with a definition as always. Single proprietor, owns the business, taking all the risks, enjoying all of the rewards. So think about perhaps a window cleaner. Window cleaner likely to operate on their own. They'll put all the money into the business. They'll take all the money out of the business. What are the features then? And again, just to give us a heads up before we start these different features. Think about the exam. Think about where they might give you a couple of characteristics and ask you which of the different legal forms this best fits into, or which of the following is a characteristic or a feature of a sole tradership. And you just need to be able to pick those out. So no legal distinction between the proprietor and the business. Okay, same thing. Proprietor is wholly liable for the debts, and we call that unlimited liability. Okay, so they have unlimited liability. Essentially means that if the debt of the sole tradership becomes excessive and they can't pay it from the business's money, the people that you owe money to can come after you personally to chase the debts. Normally financed by the money that the owners put in, maybe some loans, maybe some short-term credit from suppliers. You can offer a fixed charge over assets, such as buildings and machinery, but you can't use any floating charges. Now, what do we actually mean by this? Well, what we mean is, if I were to go to the bank as a sole trader and I owned a building, or maybe some sort of let's kind of stick to the window cleaning business. Maybe I own some sort of pressure washer, and I can say, look, I want to take out this loan. I have this pressure washer that's worth £1,000. You can use that as security. So if I don't pay back my loan, you can come and take away my pressure washer. So that just means they can have a charge over assets. Floating charge means you can't have a charge over some of your current assets, so things that change all of the time. When a sole trader takes some earnings from the business, we call that drawings. Often you'll find that sole traders do employ people still, so it's not just necessarily one person working for the business, but it's normal for the sole trader to be very active. It can be sold as a going concern. However, if the sole trader dies, there's no what we'd call perpetual succession, so the tradership ceases to exist. Okay. Advantages and disadvantages. Well, advantages, certainly flexibility. You're in charge, you're your own boss. Quick decision making, well, because you make all of the decisions, and you don't have to make any of your financial performance public. Okay. Disadvantages, only you are bringing skills to the table, and limited time. Couple more over the page there. No one to share the load, difficult to expand, and then that key one, unlimited liability, really important. Whoops. Okay, so sole trader, one person. Partnerships then, definition, the relation which subsists between persons carrying on a business in common with a view of profit. So this is just going to be two or more. Now we're going to see a bit further down here, there are actually, there are a couple of different types of partnership we're going to look at. We're going to look at general, we're going to look at limited, we're also going to look at limited liability there at the end. So before they get there, features of a partnership, very similar to a sole trader. Okay. Now, in terms of the separation between the business and the owner, really depends on what type of partnership we look at. So again, we're going to have a look a bit later, but normally your partners are jointly and severally liable for the debts, similar to a sole trader. So still going to have some financing issues, and again, we call their earnings drawings. Unlike a sole trader, obviously now there's at least two partners, so it might be possible for one of them to take a back seat. So one partner doesn't necessarily have to be involved in the day-to-day running of the business. Selling a share in a partnership might be difficult, and again, no perpetual succession. So if a partner dies, the partnership is dissolved. Okay, so first two types of partnerships we're going to look at will be general and limited. So general says there's no legal identity, and again, very similar to sole traders in that sense. Limited partnerships, again though, has no separate legal identity, but one or more partners may have what we call limited liability. So the liability that they have is limited to the money that they have in the business, so they can't come after any personal assets. However, for a limited partnership, there still has to be one fully liable partner. Advantages and disadvantages then, again, pretty similar to sole trader, very flexible, you can still be your own boss. This time, less lonely than a sole tradership. So if you don't like working on your own. No publicly available financial statements again. Multiple skills, more time and a shared workload. Obviously more than one of you. Disadvantages then over the page. Unlimited liability for debts which someone else has created. So think about the fact that your partner may make a decision which leaves you liable for the debts. If partners fall out, continuing in business will be difficult. So, kind of general day-to-day bits and pieces. Finally then, a relatively new type of partnership is what we call a limited liability partnership, or an LLP. They're actually quite similar to what we'll see in a second, limited liability companies. So they have now a separate legal identity, and because of that, they generally find it a bit easier to find funds. It's a bit easier to raise some capital. Okay, so companies. Definition of a company, this time a legal entity. Okay, so the legal entity registered under the Companies Act 2006. Now we have the owners with limited liability. Okay, so any funds that they've invested in the shares that they hold in the company, the company has unlimited liability for its own debt. So obviously the company has to pay off its own debts. So features wise, as I said, they're now a legally different entity, as well as fixed charge. So saying you can have security on this asset, we're now able as a company to offer a floating charge over our over our current assets. Shareholders take dividends now, not drawings, and directors run the company. Now it's not always going to be the case that the directors and the shareholders are the same people. In fact, very often that's not the case. So in a small business, it might be the case that the shareholders are also directors, but there's no automatic right. This time we can sell our shares relatively easily, particularly if they're publicly listed. And we'll have a think about that in a second. If one shareholder dies, they're transferred to another person. So this is finally now what we call perpetual succession. So you don't have to dissolve the company. Two different types of company we're going to look at: public company and a private company. And the main difference, or the overall difference here, is all about where you can offer your shares for sale. Okay, so a public company can offer its shares to the public at large, whereas a private company cannot. So again, exam wise, just make sure you're happy enough with the difference there. Okay, advantages and disadvantages. So now we've got this separate legal personality. Okay, limited liability for shareholders, so personal assets are no longer at risk. So if I'm a shareholder in a company, if the company gets into financial trouble, nobody's going to come knocking on my door for my house keys and my car keys. Perpetual succession, so something happening to the ownership doesn't necessarily affect the company itself. Transferability of interests, and then security for loans, including floating charges, which just means it's that bit easier to obtain funds, and also should hopefully be cheaper. Disadvantages then: separation of ownership and control. So if I'm a sole trader or in a partnership, well, I'm in control of the business. With a company, I may not necessarily be in control. We call that the agency problem. So the fact that the people running the business and the people that own the business aren't the same people. Ownership of assets. So the company owns its own assets. So just because I have a share in the company doesn't mean I have any ownership over the company vehicles, for example. We now have to keep accounting records, and some companies may have a requirement to have an audit. Also, it's now possible for our competitors to see some of our financial information. Okay, so our financial position, and also things like remuneration of directors that we have to make known. Finally then, lots of regulation, lots of red tape around us. So those are the three types of structure. Now, this table is actually just pretty good for an overview. Okay, so again, basically just outlining all of those things that we've thought about already. Okay, so succession, liability, and so on. So this is a nice table for you guys to have a look at. In terms of the exam, something like this idea of management, the fact that a company must have at least one or two directors. That's a nice thing to have there. Okay, so if you're asked a question in the exam, the fact that a private limited company has to have at least one director, and a public limited company has to have at least two. Would be a nice question in the exam. So make sure you've had a look at this table and just kind of taken in those different characteristics. Last thing for the chapter then is looking at alliances. So this is just a forging of a relationship that doesn't fall into any of those categories that we've just seen. So we'll have a look through these. We'll have a look at groups, and then that's chapter 3 finished with. So first alliance we're going to look at is a joint venture. So essentially two businesses coming together, they share the rewards of the entity created. Now, normally a limited company is formed. Okay, so for example, Tesco and Shell might come together and form a limited company to open up petrol forecourts, and they might call it something like, I don't know, Tesco Fuel or Shell Tesco, something like that. And the idea is that Tesco would bring some knowledge of the food industry, the retail industry. Shell would bring knowledge of the petrol industry or the fuel industry, and they're sharing that information, and they're both benefiting from it. Obviously, if they were both to open, or both to try and open the same type of forecourts, well, that would require A, more investment from each, and also B, they'd have to compete with each other. So coming together is always or sometimes a good idea. So benefits, as I said there, less capital required, reduces competition, no longer competing with each other, enables firms to gain access to restricted markets. So for example, some countries in the Middle East actually require any foreign firms coming into the country to form a joint venture with somebody local. So it enables you to gain access to markets that you might not be able to otherwise. Also means you have the skills of each party there, so sharing that knowledge. Disadvantages, well, at some point there's going to be a disagreement over how the business is run. If the joint venture breaks down, well, maybe Shell now have lots of knowledge about retail locations, and now they can think, well, we're going to use this to compete with Tesco. And then finally, possible lack of financial support. Licensing then is where a company gives permission to another company to make one of its products or use a brand name. Not going to be a separate entity created there. And strategic alliance is a bit like a joint venture, but kind of looser in terms of contractual agreement. So for example, national airlines have alliances to cross-book passengers. that way they're able to offer more seats, offer more routes. Benefits are similar to joint ventures. What else have we got? Looser arrangement is easier to break. There's a problem in terms of competition laws potentially. We're going to see that a bit later in the course. And you might find that the two parties are less committed. Well, in fact, almost always you'd find that. Agents then is where you allow somebody with local knowledge and contacts to sell on your behalf. So for example, think about Avon and Ann Summers, think about holiday agents and so on. So enables you to kind of sell your product, but via a third party. Last thing we're going to look at then is groups, and here's a very simple group structure here. So you've got your parent company, which owns 100% of your subsidiary. Now in reality they're going to be much more complex than that. Well, what's the point? What's good about that? It certainly allows for transfers of funds, people, and tax losses. Okay, so the relationship between the parent and the subsidiary allows different resources to be passed through. Allows different structures and cultures to be developed. Risk of failure is spread. Minority shareholdings can be retained, and means you can share lots of knowledge and expertise. Disadvantages: reporting can be very complex. Also requires lots of administration, and although risk is spread, if one of the companies in the group experiences a lot of problem or fails, it can have a big impact on everybody else. Okay, so that's the end of chapter 3. Chapter 4 then moves on to start looking at business strategy.